Chapter 4. The Story of Alan. It is the question, the unknowing ending, which bothers me the most. When I reflect on the luck of our escape that night from the Western Front's camp, that no one saw us or stopped us, I wonder how we did it when so many others failed. I marvel at how lucky Aaron and I were, but the questions always haunt me. What happened to Chris? What about Alan? Did they manage to escape? Did they die trying? I hate not knowing. I keep thinking that somewhere, out there, my parents might still be alive. That Chris and Alan might still be alive. Some part of me is scared, too. I'm scared to stop thinking of them. I guess I'm afraid that if I don't keep them alive in my memories, it will be as if they never existed, and that, consequently, a part of me will cease to exist as well. Jess's journal. Alan was an only child, on the plump side for most of his 18 years, with brown hair and kind brown eyes. He had never been outstanding in much of anything, but he was kind and considerate to family, friends, and strangers alike. His favorite person in the world was his grandfather, Thurman Banks, a soft-spoken man with a shock of white hair and brown eyes the same color as Alan's. After old Thurman hurt his knee one spring, Alan had made it a habit to walk over to his grandparents' house and mow the yard with Grandpa's antique push mower. It took a while, but then he would cool off with a tall glass of blueberry lemonade, courtesy of Gram. Later, he incorporated stopping by at Chris's house for a video game or a game of catch. He would never be as good as Chris at either activity, but his friend was always happy to see him, and Mrs. Aronson would hug him hello and usher him in the front door. She would give him a gentle push towards the basement where Chris and his friend Toby McGowan were usually hanging out. Chris was good-looking, blonde and blue-eyed. He was the star quarterback on the team, and there was talk of football scholarship, even in these bad times. Sometimes it seemed to Alan that Chris was everything that Alan was not. Good-looking, athletic, and popular. But Chris was also down-to-earth and personable. He looked out for everyone, and he had stuck up for Alan, defended him against snipes about his pudgy waist and poorly defined biceps. He had been an honest and true friend since grade school. Alan would stay for hours, sometimes for dinner, sometimes the night if it was a Saturday. Eventually, the phone would ring and it would be Gramps calling to give him a ride home. On the nights he stayed for dinner, he avoided looking at Chris's little sister, Jess. Her blonde hair fell in waves around her shoulders. Her eyes were straight out of the Crayola box blue, and, like her brother, she was unfailingly kind. She never played the bratty little sister, and would often join them in the basement with her best friend Erin, Toby's sister. They would play endless video games, or, in later years when the power had failed, they would go for hikes and picnics in the nearby woods and parks. In a way, Alan had always been in love with Jess. She was cute, sweet, and didn't seem to notice that he wasn't as good-looking or athletic as the other guys. She gave him her friendship, and thanks to the sobering fact that she was too darn pretty for him to even dare to ask out, he nurtured his little crush quietly, and didn't seek to make it any more than that. He didn't have the nerve to risk rejection, and she was Chris's little sister, after all. He was certain she was oblivious to his feelings anyway. Those endless summer nights in Belton seemed so impossibly far away. What he didn't want to remember were the last few hours he had spent in the town of his birth. The soldiers and guns. The fires set to homes and everywhere people screaming. He still had nightmares of Mrs. Brown crying in the street over the lifeless body of her husband, and one of the kids from a block up wailing for his parents. He had seen his 10th grade honors English teacher, Mrs. Grady, with half her face burned. She had run from her house as the flames licked up the walls and consumed her roof, only to be cut down in the street by a bullet. She had stood there, after the shot rang out, with a startled expression on her face. The red stain widened on her white blouse, and she had slowly crumpled to the ground. Others had been shot when they tried to return to rescue pets. Other family members or possessions. Half of the town had seemed to be on fire, and he didn't argue with the soldiers as they aimed their weapons at him. He put his arms up, submitted to them as they shoved him to the ground, and did a rough search of his pockets for weapons. The soldier searching Alan found his wallet, pulled out the cash inside, and punched him hard when he raised his head to object. The wallet, now empty of cash, was thrown to one side. His hands were bound in front of him with zip tie, and he was shoved into a large group of terrified residents. It was the stuff of nightmares, watching your home destroyed, not knowing whether your parents were alive or dead, and that most of what you loved, what you understood of the world, had been changed irredeemably. Jess's parents were among the same group of prisoners as Alan was. Mr. Aronson stayed relatively calm, struggling to ease his wife's fears, and Mrs. Aronson was nearly hysterical, worrying about Jess and Chris. She had sent Jess to the store, and Chris had taken off early in the day to visit a friend. She didn't know where. The three of them huddled together as they were marched from town, south on Y for miles. There were other groups of prisoners, mainly young men and women. The children were sometimes left behind if they caused trouble for the soldiers. This included moving too slow or crying too loud. By the end of the second day, most of the adults had exhausted themselves trying to carry the children along and avoid a confrontation with the soldiers. Already, several older men and women had been shot when they fell behind. Rumors flew thick and fast. Someone reported that they had seen the soldiers set fire to the old folks' home and laugh as its aged residents tried to escape, taking pot shots at them and those who ran to help. It was brutal, unbelievable, and Alan wondered at what had happened to the soldiers' humanity. They weren't in a foreign land, where the people looked different or spoke a different language. The soldiers were shooting people who looked like their mothers and fathers, their grandparents. Alan was witness to both of the Aronsons' end on the third day. One of the soldiers, obviously in command of the others, had had enough of the stragglers. When the man pushed his jet-black hair away from his ice-blue eyes, Alan couldn't see a trace of humanity within. Lieutenant Cooper ordered the adults holding the children to put them down and for everyone to start marching. The children were exhausted. They literally couldn't walk any further, and as they fell behind, Julie and then Michael both tried to break ranks and help them. The gap between the group of prisoners and the children was widening, and the smaller ones began to wail in fear. Alan watched helplessly as the raven-haired, blue-eyed devil shot Jess and Chris's parents. He felt frozen in time and space, and the world felt hollow. A skinny, foul-smelling soldier gave him a good shove with his rifle. To help them meant to join them in their fate, and try as he might, he wasn't ready to die. He turned away from the bodies, away from the small children grouped there on the road, and allowed the soldiers to herd him away with the other prisoners. As he marched away, Alan thought to himself, "This is what war does to us. War takes the best part of us away and makes us into something else." He watched those with some speck of humanity left in them turn away as innocents were slaughtered. The desire for survival is a strong one, and in the end, even kind-hearted Alan valued life more than the moral high ground. What Alan did in the next few days and weeks and months, what he did to survive, would haunt his dreams every night for the rest of his life. How ironic that in the months since the invasion of Belton and his own conscription, his weight had melted off, revealing a strikingly handsome profile beneath. Between the marches, the beatings and threats, and his conscription into this bastardized excuse for a company, he had lost the baby fat that had followed him so doggedly into adolescence and young adulthood. His arms and legs were now lean and muscled, his stomach tight and flat. The first time he saw his reflection, he pulled back in surprise. A different man, a stranger with haunted and hollow eyes, stared back at him. The army that he had been forced to join was no army, no company at all. They weren't soldiers. They were terrorists, thieves, and thugs all rolled into one. To save his own pitiful life, he had convinced them he wanted to join. Alan had kicked and beat the other recruits. He had visited the women in the tents. He had shouted, "Yes, sir," with the rest of them. He had done all of this in order to live another day. He had located Chris and carefully found a way for them to meet and plan an escape. They were both still watched, Chris more than Alan, because he had resisted. Alan had found a way to get near him and talk. He picked a fight and lost and got latrine duty. He knew Chris was already there. Then he had punched Chris, yelled at him, talked trash, and after the initial shock, his friend wised up to the act and played along. They kept getting themselves in just enough trouble to be assigned the dirty jobs no one else wanted. Then they called insults at each other so that everyone was sure they hated one another. He found ways to communicate important troop movements and other news to his friend. Alan was able to update Chris that Jess and her friend Erin were both in Tent 5. When Chris first heard about it, he nearly screwed it up for both of them. He lost it so bad. The thought of Jess in that awful place had stopped him in his tracks, and he grabbed Alan's shoulder in a painful grip. Alan had punched him hard enough to knock his friend down on the ground with a thump. He hadn't said anything for a long time after that, just stared into the distance. Then he'd got up, dusted himself off, and pulled himself together. Over time, through the bitter cold of winter, they found ways to meet. Sometimes they would find a way to speak while in line for slop, near the showers, or by picking a fight and getting latrine duty again. Whatever it took, they had to escape, and take the girls with them. It was Chris who had managed to get the handcuff key. He passed it to Alan reluctantly. They'd argued about this over and over. He wanted to go to Tent 5 and see Jess. Alan knew what would happen. Chris would lose it again and make a scene. He would fight to get her out, and they'd both end up dead. Jess needed out, and Alan was going to move heaven and earth to make sure that happened. Winter was ending, and the storm would soon turn from chilly winds to wet, tumultuous rainstorms. He had seen the first green weeds and spring flowers emerging. There had been a patch of jonquils and tulips in the ruins of an old farm just half a day's walk from here. He was sent out as part of a raiding party mid-March, and recognized that winter would soon be over, early even, if the increase in vegetation and greenery were any indication. It was his willing participation in that particular raid which relieved any lingering concerns about where his loyalties lay. This freed him to roam freely through the camp, which was the next to final step needed towards putting their escape into motion. The raid, which had included actions that plagued him with nightmares, was a success, and he and the other soldiers were rewarded with a visit to Tent 5. He'd been there twice before. Once after he'd kicked the crap out of Chris, punching him in the face while slipping the note he'd written to his friend into his front pocket, while he lay stunned and bleeding on the ground. The other time was when he kept some poor newbie recruit in line and stopped him from trying a very poorly planned escape attempt. He'd made it look like the kid had been stealing extra rations instead of getting ready to run. He'd saved the kid's life, but doubted the kid even realized it. In any case, it hadn't really helped him that much. A few days later, the boy had made another attempt, and this time, no one bothered to try and stop him. He was shot dead less than 10 yards from the tree line. Alan knew exactly where Jess was being kept, although before this he hadn't been to her room. Her screams, coming from the opposite end of the tent the first time he had visited the tent, had given him nightmares. The thought of her being used in such a way twisted his guts in knots, and he had restrained himself with difficulty from running in, killing that monster Cooper and attempting some stupid and doomed escape. It had been a solid month before he could return, and even then he wasn't sure he could see her like that, so he stayed on the other side and did not attempt contact. Now that spring was coming, with the possible cover of thunderstorms, they could all escape. Footprints couldn't be as easily tracked without snow and ice on the ground. Alan took a deep breath as he entered the tent, his guts twisting at the sounds that came from this awful, soul-killing place. It had been nearly 4 months since he had seen her. He steeled himself for it and pushed aside her room flap and walked in. She was lying there, not handcuffed. Thank God, they only did that at night now. She wore a faded red Western front uniform shirt, and she had a thin blanket covering the rest of her. Someone had just finished with her. Alan's bile rose in his throat as the soldier had swaggered past, zipping up his pants. Alan ignored him and held himself back from doing great violence at that moment. It was all he could do not to turn around and grab the guy from behind in a sleeper hold. It would be righteous and satisfying to choke the life out of him. She didn't recognize him until he had climbed on top of her and leaned in close. In that moment, she stiffened. It had certainly happened before with some of the boys she had known in high school. They were conscripts, here under the same circumstances as Alan, But as the months stretched out, and the distance between Belton and this place grew, they slowly changed. The tent had seen a slow uptick in visits from conscripts. They avoided each other's gaze if they met in the corridors, but shame didn't stop them from coming back. Her body was warm and soft underneath him. She smelled like vanilla and musk. He whispered in her ear the plan and slipped her the handcuff key. He was embarrassed to realize he had a hard-on, although who would have blamed him? It was natural. She was beautiful and sweet. Even now, in this terrible place, she was everything he had ever wanted. Maybe after this was all over, when they escaped. With effort, he banished the thought and hope of it from his mind. Back to business. It was time to act tough like he did with Chris in front of the others. He kissed her lightly on the cheek, and took one great liberty, kissing her on the lips. Then he had slapped her thigh hard, talked shit, and got up and walked out of the room. It was the grand and dramatic exit, and it had its effect. Carmen, that monstrous and sexless creature, laughed and pointed him down the hall towards another open room. As he walked away, his hand strayed to his lips, still feeling the softness of hers against his, and he realized that the only thing that had stopped him from grabbing her and running like hell for the door was the image of Chris trying to do it, and how it would look when he failed. He had done what he could. Now Jess would have to get her and Aaron out at the right time. Cross their fingers, cross the toes, and a truckload of luck, and they all might make it out of there alive. His pretty fantasy of them escaping hand in hand together was shot to hell when Chris refused to head west that fateful night. Instead, he insisted on heading towards Tennessee. "The girls will need a head start in plenty of time. I'm heading southeast, so hopefully the trackers will follow my trail. There are 3 others who know we are planning something and want in on it." Alan did not like the sound of this. Together, they had a better chance of survival, but 3 new guys he hadn't met and didn't know if he even trusted? Alone, what would the girls do in the wilderness? How could they cover their tracks or survive? He asked all of these questions and more of Chris. "Erin knows plenty of survival skills. Her parents were some kind of survival nuts, and Toby knew so much he could practically teach the rest of us how to live off the land and survive during any season. The family went camping all the time. Jess has the key, so she will get them out of there and Aaron will keep them fed. Besides," he said, sounding more confident than he felt, "we just need to do big circles and then get everyone back to Belton. Not everything burned, not everyone is dead." Alan just shook his head. This was not what they had planned. "I'll head northwest, get back up to Highway 60. Hopefully I'll meet them along the way to Springfield. Don't go far into Tennessee. Double back, and we'll all join up again." It was wishful thinking, this plan of theirs. Its success was contingent on so many variables, and each of them had to go just right for success to occur. Despite the horrors of the past few months, Alan and Chris were still young and idealistic. They had no idea just how badly the plan would go wrong. In the violent storm that followed, the 3 other men were shot in the back before they ran past the outermost tent on the north. The girls made it out and took off west, straight into the storm. Alan watched as they disappeared into the trees. Their escape was successful. No one raised an alarm until one of the guards had gone looking for something sweet at 3 a.m. When he realized Aaron's bed was empty of anything but a strategically placed pillow, he had woken the entire camp. Chris had also run into the night without incident, heading southeast towards Tennessee. Alan had delayed leaving until he was sure no one was following the girls. He was caught the following day as he lay wrapped in a sodden blanket, having passed out under a fallen tree, exhausted from running. The memory of Jess's body beneath him kept him focused when they interrogated him. He had said nothing when their fists smashed his nose and knocked out 2 of his teeth. But he had screamed. Oh God, how he had screamed as Cooper's knife cut deep into his ankles, ensuring he would never, ever manage to escape again, or ever really walk. But Alan knew his time was up. They had thrown the dice, and while some had won to play another day, he was a dead man. He said as little as possible, grinding his teeth as Cooper cut on him, and finally screaming when the pain got to be too much. He told them nothing more than they already knew. They knew that Jess, Aaron, Alan, and Chris had all come from the same small town. In his heart, he nourished the hope that their escape was certain now. It had been 3 days and no word. Cooper leaned close, shoved the knife in all the way to the hilt, and twisted it back and forth in the deserter's gut. He smiled as Alan's eyes glazed in agony. He figured he had about 20 minutes, maybe 30, before the little crap died. He took his time, described how he had screwed the little whores, both of them, but especially the little blonde one, every possible way, again and again. He promised the boy he would do it again when he found them, over and over and over, until they were both dead. He was pissed off and frustrated. Kipling would have a cow when he found out that he had knifed this little weasel, but at the moment, he didn't care. Alan knew he was dying. He felt removed from it all. As the pain seemed to fade away, he could smell her still. That sweet, fresh scent as he had laid against her in Tent 5 stayed with him. He cherished that memory, held it close, and ignored the man standing over him. It pissed Cooper off that the kid took almost 40 minutes to die. He'd never seen anyone hang on that long. But what pissed him off the most is that when the damn fool finally did die, he was smiling.